Greetings, everyone. My name is Della. I'm an author and community organizer based in the Toronto area, and I focus on educating the Black community on Pan-Africanism, ancient history, anti-Blackness, socioeconomics, and how all those topics are interconnected. I'm currently pursuing my bachelor's degree in journalism, and I wrote my first book, 166 Days of Excellence, which is a calendar guide of heroic and courageous figures and events related to worldwide liberation advancements that are not normally taught in schools. The topic for this PowerPoint presentation is the historical foundation of systematic anti-Blackness in Canada, which was inspired by the book Policing Black Lives by Robyn Maynard, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to Present. I was motivated to do this 4-part series to help educate not just Black people living in Canada, but everyone interested in independent studies that is purposely not taught in schools. I wanted to create an easy to follow timeline because this is the first book of its kind pertaining to history in Canada, and it was only written in 2017. I think it's very important to understand how systematic anti-Blackness works to build meaningful solutions for the Black community. As Black people, we are targeted, or at least know someone who has been targeted by some form of anti-Blackness, but just because we have been targeted doesn't mean we fully understand why and how we are targeted. Consider this example. If a stranger punched you in the face and attacks you, hopefully, I would hope your urge is to fight back and defend yourself. But just because you have the desire to fight back doesn't mean you know how to fight or you know how the stranger fights. If you have no knowledge in self-defense, you will only apply yourself to the first thing that comes to your mind in a reactionary emotional state. You can't stop the fight to learn how to fight. So the best time to train how to fight is anytime before it actually happens. But you will never know if a fight will happen. If you stay ready, you won't have to get ready. So in the context of anti-Blackness, education helps us understand how we are attacked so we can effectively build long-lasting solutions of defense. So before I get started, this presentation is dedicated to my publisher, Desiree Crooks, who transitioned in August to the spiritual realm, who fought against ovarian cancer. She was dedicated to teaching children, and she published a children's book on the liberation story of Queen Nzinga. And she was on the verge of actually opening up a daycare before the pandemic struck. I was blessed to have known her and published my first book with her, 166 Days of Excellence. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to jump into today's presentation. Historical Foundation of Canadian Systematic Anti-Blackness. Week 3, Criminalization and Sexualization of Black Identity. Now, before we begin, I want to set the tone for this presentation from a quote from Neely Fuller Jr. From the United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, a textbook workbook for thought, speech, and/or action for victims of racism, aka white supremacy. If you do not understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. The purpose of this presentation is to give the Black diaspora the context and historical framework on how systematic anti-Black racism was founded in Canada. The term anti-Blackness is interchangeable with white supremacy. Anti-Blackness at its core includes white supremacy. Anti-Blackness also encompasses non-white, and even Black people, whether conscious or subconscious, who carry negative thoughts, attitudes, speech, and behavior that only serves to maintain white supremacy or anti-Blackness over Black people. Now, the learning objectives for this presentation will be the two pillars of systematic racism in the misjustice system and media, the anti-Black attitude before Canada's adoption of a multicultural identity, Canada's history of overt anti-Blackness, systematic role of media in perpetuating the over-sexualization of both Black women and men. Now, we went through week 1, enslavement and segregation, and week 2, labor and immigration. So this is just a recap. First records of enslavement in early Canada began in 1628 and ended in 1833. Enslavement was mainly practiced through private ownership. Segregation practices through education, housing, and labor. Second-class citizenship existed for Black and Indigenous people. Immigration and labor opportunities were restricted from Black immigrants. Europeans were welcomed with open arms. These immigration and labor policies were an extension of enslavement and segregation. Canada's multicultural identity wasn't instituted till 1970s onward. The 1800s, according to Cheryl Thompson, a scholar of communications of Ryerson University, Black residents of Toronto petitioned the city government in vain to ban minstrel shows in the 1840s. And this is a picture of a Virginia minstrel show in 1843 in the United States. I tried my best to find a picture of some type of Toronto ad or picture or some sort showing what was going on here in Canada. But this is why I put this quote here to show how far back minstrel shows existed right here in Canada. In a 2005 doctoral thesis, University of Toronto researcher Lorraine Almayer, Louis Lecomte documented hundreds of minstrel performances across Canada from the 1840s to the 1960s. So that's 100 years, more than 100 years. These included shows mounted by charitable organizations, religious groups, schools, and members of the military and law enforcement. So this is a common slide that has come up several times in the presentation by Mary Ann Shadd, an abolitionist journalist, and in 1852 in the newspaper The Voice of the Fugitive, she coined the term anti-slavery Negro hater for white Canadians. This was a two-tier label, anti-slavery meaning that white Canadians at that time were against slavery and its practices. Not all of them, but I'm sure that was a sentiment. But Negro hater also meant that the white Canadians did not want to. They did not like Black people at all. They called it the Negro problem from America, and they might have been against enslavement, but they did not want to actively coexist with Black people either, which will be demonstrated in the following decades. White Canadians thought the best way to deal with the Negro problem in America was to block Black people coming into Canada in the first place, and they didn't logically think that was racist. 1858 to 1958, 100 years of data. Data compiled shows disparity of severity of Black men punished for rape against white women compared to leniency of white men accused of rape against Black women. So this just shows the hypocrisy of white men worrying about the morality of Black men and worrying about their women while simultaneously raping Black women, and they're not even handing out justice for that. So it's just a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of black and white with how white men viewed black men as sexual threats, while simultaneously over sexualizing black women as well. 1864 to 1873, black women are 3% of the Halifax population, but make up 40% of incarceration rates in Halifax. Prostitution charge was a way for black women to be policed and monitored. 1867, British colonies in North America consolidate Canada as a nation on stolen land. 1868, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald evokes the Black rapist myth to justify the threat of lynch mobs to keep rape a capital offense. He made white settlers fear frequency of rape committed by Negroes because Negroes were very prone to felonious assaults on white women. If the sentence and imprisonment were not severe, there would be a great dread of people taking the law into their own hands. 1879, prostitution laws added to the Indian Act increased access into indigenous homes in reserves. Black women are already disproportionately affected by prostitution laws in Hamilton, Vancouver, Toronto, and Calgary. At one point, prostitution laws allowed for the arrest of all common prostitutes or night walkers. Night walkers is a code word, wandering in fields, public streets, or highways and not giving a satisfactory account of themselves. Black and Indigenous women's worth in Canadian society was devalued as they were over-sexualized and more vulnerable to sexual assaults from white men. 1886, Indigenous prohibited from buying or consuming alcohol, leading to mass incarceration. So this term night walker was a very vague term that didn't necessarily mean prostitution. Many Black women that were working, especially working long hours and long shifts, I touched on it in the presentation of labor and immigration, how they worked long hours, up to 16 hours for some jobs, and they would have to come back home at nighttime. So they would have to work these long hours, come back at night, and then be prosecuted and surveilled because they were just walking at night. Thus the term night walkers, and they connected that to prostitution. 1900s, data compiled between 1908 and 1960, Black people convicted of violent crimes are punished more severely than white people. 1911, the Black man as a menace to white society. So with this story of an individual named Hazel Huff, who made up a break and enter and robbery of a diamond ring. She also claimed that she was drugged and sexually assaulted by Black men. So basically media hysteria ensues and public panic follows. We have terms like the Black Peril, Negro atrocity, the same sentiment of the former Prime Minister John A. Macdonald evoked with the Black rapist myth in 1868. So this idea was continuing on. This idea was continuing on of the over-sexualization, the hypersexualization of the Black man. So this is from the North of the Color Line. This was a book that I spoke about in the Labor and Immigration presentation. 9 days after initial reports of Hazel's maltreatment at the hands of a Black intruder, the young white woman confessed that her entire story had been a racial red herring. Huff admitted that, fearing punishment for losing her mother's ring, she fabricated the attack by a big, burly nigger, specifically because of the outcry over Black immigration. So she just used the hysteria, she just used the atmosphere and the feelings towards Black immigration to create this story that she knew she would get immediate support from and that nobody would question. The chief of Edmonton police knew 7 days before Hazel's public confession, but he wanted to pour fuel into the anti-African immigration sentiment. The goal was to pressure federal government into further restricting Black immigration. The same year, the city of Edmonton passed a resolution to ban Black people. The same year, the Imperial Order of Daughters of the Empire petitioned to the federal government for Black men to be excluded in society. So imagine a feminist group calling for the government to exclude Black men from society because of this idea of hypersexualization and this idea, this false sense of the need for protection against them. The Edmonton Capital, March 27, 1911. This was a Edmonton newspaper. An Edmonton woman continued this tradition and was quoted in an Edmonton Bulletin article titled "Woman Utters Protest Against Negro Invasion." She warned, "I see the finger of fate pointing to lynch law in the North Country, which will be the ultimate result, as sure as we allow such people to settle among us. There can scarcely be anyone who is not aware of the atrocities committed by members of these terrible communities, the only corresponding punishment for which is the lawless lynching. Already it is reported that there, white women in Edmonton and Peace River districts have been victims of these outrages accomplished in peculiarly fiendish abandon. Where will the end be?" And this is a direct quote from the newspaper. So now we get into 1915, the first cinematic movie, Birth of a Nation. I know this is American, but this movie had a very big impact in the movie industry in terms of cinema. This was the original Birth of the Nation that the director and filmmaker Nate Parker took the name from for his movie, his Birth of a Nation. That was a story about the life of Nat Turner, the preacher turned slave revoltist in the United States. And he did it specifically because the mark that this movie left in cinema. So he did that strategically. The Birth of a Nation landmark silent film released in 1915 that was the first blockbuster Hollywood hit. It was the longest and most profitable film that produced and the most artistically advanced film of its day. It secured both the future of feature-length films and the reception of film as a serious entertainment medium. A narrative about the American Civil War, 1861 to 65, and the Reconstruction era that followed. It has long been hailed for its technical and dramatic innovations, but condemned for the racism inherent in the script and its positive portrayal of the Ku Klux Klan. And this was also a story. This is a more of a textbook definition, but this was a story about the Ku Klux Klan saving a white woman from Black men. And as you see here, these two pictures is supposed to depict a Black man. Obviously, he's wearing blackface. The Birth of the Nation is the same Black rapist sentiment that John A. MacDonald evoked in 1868. The difference now is the first full feature movie served as a confirmation bias towards Black immigration and segregation. So what do I mean by confirmation bias? Essentially, everything that white people were telling themselves about the hypersexualization of Black men was now being presented in a movie as if it were fact. The idea of protecting white women's virtuehood was more about policing Black males. white males were given leniency against white women and more so against Black women in terms of sexual assaults. Black women were left vulnerable against sexual assaults from white men. KKK presence in Canada, 1920, St. Catharines, Ontario, lynching attempt of Black ex-soldier, 1922, KKK presence in Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Ontario, and Quebec, 1927, 1,000 gathered to burn a cross in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and declare one flag, one language, one race, one religion, one purity, and moral rectitude. In 1930, 75 Klansmen terrorized interracial couple Ira Johnson and Isabel Jones. Oakville Mirror quoted as saying they acted quite properly. The Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire and Women's Christian Temperance Union call for the protection of white women. So again, feminist groups calling for the protection of white women against Black men. So the Civil Rights era in Canada, 1940, Black protesters at Yonge Street gather at Yonge Street because a Black boy was denied entry into a skating rink. 1941, 80% of Black women in Montreal employed as domestic workers, working 16-hour days, hostile Black work environments under white people. 1941, Indigenous pass systems installed in 1855 ends. 1945, first collective agreement of Black Union between Black Railway Porters and Canada Pacific Railway. Black people have been organizing and mobilizing around labor rights in previous years. In 1946, November 8, Viola Desmond refuses to leave Roseland Theatre in Nova Scotia. She sat in the more expensive and implicitly whites-only section of the theater. She was asked to move and eventually forced to be removed. So activists against anti-Blackness in Canada. We have Bromley Armstrong, a long record of activism, including testing the Fair Accommodation Practices Act of 1954, Ontario's new legislation against discrimination. Armstrong and fellow activists of diverse backgrounds visited restaurants in Dresden, Ontario, that continued to refuse service to non-white customers and applied to landlords in Toronto who turned away Black and other racialized renters in Edmonton. We have Ted King, who challenged racial segregation in his role as the president of the Alberta Association for the Advancement of Colored People, AAACP. In 1958, he spearheaded a lawsuit against the Barclay Motel because the owner informed him that we don't allow colored people here. King used the courts to effect social change. And we have Marlene Green, founded the Black Education Project in Toronto in the late 1960s to advocate for Black students who experience systematic racism in the public school system. She wrote the first report on race relations in Toronto, in the Toronto Board of Education in 1979 after facilitating a community consultations which detailed recommendations to address parent concerns. So 1960s, the end of minstrel shows in the US, as minstrels was very common throughout Canada into the 1970s. This is a picture of a minstrel show, one of the many different types of minstrel shows. So in conclusion, Canadian media and entertainment was and still is been calculated in their role in destroying the moral image of Black people. This led to delusional fear and mass criminalization of Black people. White people justified their fears by believing that there was a threat of hypersexualization, while they were the ones to perpetuate sexual degeneracy. So the key areas: media, blackface, political statements, white fear, and we have the same results: poverty, police state, mental health, miseducation, increasing wealth gap. So week 4 will be the wealth gap. So I hope you learned a lot in this presentation. I hope you've been taking notes. If you want to support me in creating more presentations and more work, I'll leave a link to my book, 166 Days of Excellence, in the description box. So thank you for tuning in, and hope to see you tune into the next one.